we're struggling to let people into the Zoom room, so we're just going to sing for a moment. Actually, we'll sing for a moment and then we'll get this started. Let's enjoy. Hemadeta leharerios, leharerios. Hemadeta leharerios, leharerios. Welcome, everyone. Yeah. Is there something that I should help you here, though?
No, I'm going to go. Okay. I'll go join it my own.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to just name the fact that our Zoom friends are not yet with us, and so may they join us really soon. But I also want us to be able to begin here, and then we will do some, as soon as we know that our Zoom friends are with us, we'll do some catching up. So it is my joy to be able to welcome my teachers and friends, Martha Ackelsberg and Judith Plaskow, to the Twin Cities, back to the Twin Cities. They installed me at Shir Tikva last night, which was in a ritual that I will be metabolizing for many, many weeks to come. So thank you for that. And now we just get to be inside of this time outside of time, together learning. I have watched my teachers and my friends be inside of the depth of our tradition and ask our tradition to be accountable to the world in which we live. And I've also watched both of you be tremendous forces for justice and call on the world in which we live to keep reaching for something that is wholer. And something that is more dignified for the people and dignifying for the humans and living creatures that are on this planet. So I am grateful to you for coming here and for opening this space to us for learning. Thank you. And I am just so grateful to get to turn it over to you now, to get to learn by your sides.
Well, we're very grateful to be here and to have had the opportunity, especially to be here last night and to be part of what took place here. It was very moving for us as well. So we're going to begin a little bit tongue-in-cheek with a song that I hope you know, and if you don't, the words are very simple. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. Torah, 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 tziva lanu Moshe. In case you don't know, the words mean Moshe commanded us the Torah. Okay, so that's part of our beginning or non-beginning for the study today. So this workshop comes out of experiences and questions that Judith and I have been thinking about for a long time. In 1981, a group that became our Jewish Feminist Spirituality Collective met for the first time in a beautiful spot in a small town outside of New York City. On Shabbat morning, we decided to hold our service in the woods with a Torah that one of our members had brought. The parsha for that week was Bamidbar, the first few chapters of which, first chapters of the book of Numbers, mostly dealing with the census of the people. The Haftarah was from the book of Hosea, in which the prophet compares the idolatry of the people of Israel to the unfaithfulness of an adulterous wife in quite graphic and violent images. In the middle of the reading of the Haftarah, one of our members lost it completely, stopped the reading, and said that, especially at a feminist gathering, we could not, should not be reading this text. In fact, it should not be read anywhere. It was time for a moratorium on reading such texts. We did stop the reading, and she went on to write an important article called Prophets and Pornography. We have held that moment in our collective memories for the past 42 years as a profound example of the discomfort and anger caused by some of our supposedly sacred texts. The issue of difficult texts has certainly not gone away in the last few decades. We often come to Shul, I assume here as well as every place else, seeking some sort of spiritual sustenance and some respite from the week, and being bombarded by the problems in the world. But then, time and again, we find ourselves brought up short by something in the prayers or the songs or the readings for that day. What feels problematic to each of us will vary. For one person, it might be the male language of the liturgy or the images of domination and violence. For someone else, it could be the context of the specific Torah and Haftarah readings. But possibly for each of us, there comes a moment when we ask, why are we reading this? How can I keep reading this? Or we say to ourselves, I can't or won't keep reading this. So we're interested in exploring this afternoon, in the relatively short amount of time we have, the question of how we respond on a personal level when we experience such moments, what we do with them for ourselves, and what we might do with them on the level of a community. How do we acknowledge the ugly places in the tradition? And are there things we just shouldn't be reading or saying anymore? Or ever, but it's too late for the ever part. And if we have time, we'd like to touch on a third level, namely the political context and implications of difficult texts today. So we're gonna, for the next 5 minutes, I'd ask you to turn to somebody next to you. We're gonna do a brief chavruta, a brief study together, and we're gonna ask you to talk about two questions. If you brought a text with you, or an idea of a difficult text, what text did you bring? If you didn't bring a text with you, that's okay too. What comes to mind when I say, what's a difficult text? What do you not want to read ever again? What causes problems when you look at it? What text did you bring? And what's difficult about it for you? Okay, so we're going to do a total of 5 minutes, so it's about 2 minutes each, and then we'll come back and ask a few of you anyway, to report back to the whole group what you talked about. Okay, so find yourself a partner and
What?
and we have some chumashim up here if anybody wants them. finish up your last sentence or something, and then we'll come back together. So this is a pretty large group. We don't really have time to hear from everyone, but we'd like to hear from a bunch of people. So if you would like to share something about from your chavruta, what text you chose, why it was difficult, and then when people say what that is, if you had come up with the same text, feel free to raise your hand. Okay? So, okay.
We had three texts. One was the nationalism and the binary good versus evil in Psalms.
Uh-huh.
One was the story of the Maccabees just as a whole. And
Yeah, I'll repeat. Okay, so one was nationalism and the binaries of good and evil in the Psalms.
and then the story of the Maccabees.
The story of the Maccabees.
And then just Karl Bach melodies.
Karl Bach melodies. Okay, so anybody have any affinity with, anybody came up with those same, any one of those? Okay, at least one other person.
More to say. Just saying yes, I did.
Okay, who else? Another report. There's a lot of talking going on, so.
Let's see. I brought in 1 Kings 5, where Solomon is about to build the first Beis Hamikdash, and he imposes corvée labor on a bunch of not so emphasized people. There's something at the end about the men of Gebal, but it's an odd passage. And then my chavruta partner brought up the story of Hajar and her banishment by Sarah and Avraham.
Okay, so you also had anybody else have those same, one or more of those same stories? Yes, okay, a few. Okay, over here. Oh, wait a minute, who's got the mic? Okay, so somebody wants to.
I have a section from Tazria that goes extensively about the impurity of a woman after giving birth.
Okay, the impurity of a woman after labor. Anybody else have that text? Okay. Other right there. Okay.
The story of Lot when he offers up his daughters to the raging crowd.
Anybody else? Okay. Over here.
I had a lot of trouble thinking of one because I felt so overwhelmed by so many, but one that has continued to trouble me for many years, and particularly at this time, is the end of the book of Esther, when the Jews not only defend themselves from those who have attacked them, but then go on to massacre a lot of people.
Okay, the end of the book of Esther. Anybody else have that one? Okay. Let's take a couple more and then we'll move on. Okay.
We had almost that one, blotting out the memory of Amalek after you've secured yourself in the land and they're no longer any threat to you. And then related to that, I think you said the whole story from Joshua through Judges, where basically the conquest of the land at the expense of the people who are in the land. Those all seem kind of related to the end of Esther. And you also had one about the whole idea of the scapegoat, of taking your sins, throwing them on the scapegoat, and everybody's okay.
Okay, and I think there was another hand right over in this. Oh, was anybody else with those texts, by the way, first? Okay. A couple more. Yeah.
I just opened up my Torah and thought, oh, something on here will be disagreeable to me. So I opened to Sarah treating Hagar poorly, and then 2 pages later was the circumcision, and the covenant was between men and them being circumcised. But where were the women getting a covenant? Or how was that going to happen?
Okay, anybody have those?
So I'm looking in the chat with our friends on Zoom, And we have, just to read a litany of challenging texts. 1 Samuel 15, where God commands Saul to slaughter every Amalekite, man, woman, child, and infant, and then Saul loses his favor when he doesn't do so. Disturbed by the Tamar story, the daughter of David raped, and also how so many women's stories seem to be cut short or edited out. I didn't have a specific one, but any instance where God tells the Jewish people to wipe out some other group of people.
Okay, we've got quite a quite a potpourri or buffet table of texts here, and this is just obviously touching the surface. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a lot, and it's reminding me that there was a point at which I used to say that I didn't decide to remain committed to Judaism because I added up all the positive texts and all the negative texts, and the positive text won. I'm not sure which would win, actually, if one really added them up. But I want to talk a little about how Jewish tradition has dealt with problematic texts. And I think it's important to recognize at the beginning that the problem with difficult texts would disappear if we could simply historicize them. In other words, if we could just say, look, they were written a long time ago, they come out of radically different cultures with different values, then we could think about them in the same way that we think about the Gilgamesh epic or the Enuma Elish or other ancient texts. And of course, they were written a long time ago, and they do reflect different cultures with different values, but the problem arises because we continue to relate to them as sacred texts, right? We read and reread them, we study them, we chant them. In the synagogue, we parade around with the Torah. I don't know if you lift it up and say, this is the Torah that came from God through Moses. We sing songs like Torah, 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 Torah. And because...
We kiss it.
Right, we kiss it. Right. Yeah, I mean, we're eager to kiss it, which is really interesting. And because we can't just relegate difficult texts to the past, they pose theological and spiritual and educational problems. I mean, is this really what God wants? Did God really say any of the things that, have come up here, and I'm sure other texts that you have looked at in your Hebruta? How can we be more ethical than our sacred texts? What does that mean? And how do we teach such texts to children? I mean, that's a huge question always. At the same time, it's hardly as if we're the first generation of Jews to have this problem or to raise these questions. Jewish communities over the generations have used a variety of strategies to address difficult texts. And I want to name 3 of them this afternoon. 1, ignore them. 2, interpret them redemptively. Or 3, confront them. Now, it may seem facetious to say ignore difficult texts, but it happens a lot. In fact, I would say that's almost the dominant strategy in a lot of communities. It's a strategy that's found across the denominational spectrum, but I think it's especially tempting for liberal Jews because we're familiar and comfortable with the idea of reading tradition selectively. And in the Reform movement, it's actually an established principle to leave things out that you don't like. If you look at the the Chumash there, my guess is that that part of Hosea that led our friend to throw a fit probably is not there. The Haftorah readings are truncated. In the conservative Megillah, the translation leaves out chapter 9. It's just not there. I mean, it's really funny. But there are 3 verses from it that are translated.
That's the chapter.
That's a chapter, that ends with the massacre. The chapter of the massacre is left out. And then, on a micro level, on a week-to-week level, no Dvar Torah can focus on everything. So why wouldn't you focus on what's positive and meaningful as opposed to what's troubling? Now, a text that I especially hate is one that was mentioned, and that is Lot's offering his virgin daughters to the men of Sodom. But this is like 2 verses that comes in the middle of an incredibly rich Parsha, Vayera, which has the birth of Isaac. It has Abraham challenging God about Sodom and Gomorrah. Why talk about Lot when you could talk about all these other wonderful things? And it could be totally appropriate any given week not to lift up what's difficult. But when avoidance becomes habitual, or when you just leave out the translation of a chapter, I think it's very problematic. First of all, it's intellectually dishonest. So, if we claim that we get our values from the tradition, what about the values of sexism and homophobia? I mean, those are also traditional values, and they don't disappear just because we don't talk about them. So, we can ignore the verse in Leviticus 18 saying to lie with a man is an abomination, but it's sure active in the culture. And there's a way in which silence becomes a form of collusion, to my mind, because it normalizes the violence. If we don't mention Lot's daughters, are we saying it's okay? It doesn't need to be talked about. We all know, we don't think that anymore, so it doesn't need to be discussed. So the second strategy is to read problematic text redemptively. And there are many different kinds of readings that fall into this category, and they're not necessarily in conflict with acknowledging the problems in a text. What links redemptive readings is a conviction that sacred texts must have something of positive moral value to teach us. A lot of traditional midrash falls into this category. For example, the rabbis were very troubled by Lot offering his daughters to the men of Sodom. And they said, ordinarily, a man sacrifices himself for his family. What's going on here? Lot was unable to sacrifice himself because he was influenced by living in an evil city. But he was punished, say the rabbis, by his daughters getting him drunk and becoming pregnant by him. So they recognize the problem, and at the same time, they find a way to redeem it. Hasidic readings often redeem a text by internalizing its message. For example, the commandment to exterminate Amalek gets read as trying to control and expunge the evil impulses within us. And there are a lot of Hasidic readings that do that. And such readings, again, can be enormously important. They can offer us great insight. We can appreciate reading Midrash for the ways in which the rabbis saw the same problems we did, even if they responded to them differently. But redemptive readings can also sidestep deeper and more pervasive problems in the text. What if the issue, in the case of Lot offering his daughters, isn't just that Lot is a child of Sodom, but the assumption that fathers own their daughters' sexuality, which is found throughout the Torah, that being just one example of it. So a third strategy, and one that I think is employed least frequently, is to confront difficult texts and muck around in them, in their difficulty. Sorry. It's not that one should do that all the time. As someone who's fond of mucking around with difficult texts, I recognize that it can get wearing after a while, if that's your primary strategy, but sometimes. So whatever the rabbis might say about Lot, the Torah does not condemn him. That he offers his daughters in a context in which he's being differentiated by his hospitality from everyone else in Sodom. It's better to offer your daughters than to allow the violation of a guest. That seems clear that that's the perspective of Torah. So what does it mean to linger with this? And with other such texts in all their painfulness. What if instead of ignoring or redeeming them, we acknowledge the ways in which such texts hold up a mirror to some of the more terrible aspects of our world? Rebecca Alpert said many years ago in her book, Like Bread on the Seder Plate, that every year when the passage condemning sex between men was read, it should be Gay Pride Month in every synagogue in the country. And there should be panels that in the synagogue inviting gay people to come and speak and to talk about homophobia in the culture. What if the week we read about Lot's daughters becomes the occasion for reflecting on the pervasiveness of violence against women in our culture and in the world? How do we use painful texts, again, to hold up a mirror, to let us examine aspects of our society which haven't changed despite the changes in culture and in the values that we pay lip service to. So what we'd like to do is turn back to...
We're going to see if there were any...
Oh, yes, right, yes. Sorry. So let me pause for a moment and ask whether there are questions or responses, thoughts to that, and then we're going to move back into a four-person Hebruta and go back to the passages that you lifted up before and think about how you might deal with them.
My question goes back to the first coping strategy of ignoring text, and I'm wondering if you think that omitting text or not reading text helps get those harmful messages out of the culture, or if you think that just ignoring them actually helps those messages go unnoticed, or if it's both, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have to say, I really, that's a question that I hugely struggle with. I think that for people who grew up with the text, it's immensely important to look at them and, struggle with them and stay with them in all their horror. But when I ask myself, what do we want to teach our children? That becomes different. Do we want to pass on the text to them so that they have the same struggles a generation later? Do we want to not do that? As someone who grew up Reform, and when I, came to the prayer book and a fuller sense of the tradition later was really angry that stuff had been hidden from me, that I didn't even know was there. It wasn't my choice, it was their choice. So I have lots of different feelings about that. I don't have a clear response.
Yeah.
The thing that comes to mind is the whole concept of tolerating queer culture versus embracing it. And then I think that that's partly the dilemma that I come to when we sort of talk about that piece.
Can you say more? I mean, I know what you mean by tolerating queer culture, but what do you mean in terms of the text?
Well, for me at work, there's a lot of people who know, right? But then there's this piece of like, well, we'll just not talk about it, and we'll sort of slide it under the table.
Right.
And because I work with people, my clients are often people who don't choose me because I'm a queer identified person, that I sort of go along with that. But that's sort of that piece of tolerating versus embracing. Like I had a coworker say to me, downstairs in the clinic, they're handing out rainbow masks. That's awful. I mean, she said that, right? I mean, she knows, right? And I was like, no one says you have to wear one. You can wear whatever you want. And she was like, well, does our company embrace them? And it was just this whole big to-do. And that to me was a really good example of how, normally she just tolerates it in either me or our clients. But there's a way that she just, and I know she won't embrace it, but I feel like as a group we could embrace it more.
Yeah, and to me, embracing means confronting. Yeah. Right. You can't embrace until you can't embrace till you've gone through what.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take one more.
Yeah.
I often wonder what the Bible of 3,000 years from now, what the difficult text will be then when they're trying to relate what's happening in the world now. And just as the ancient texts we study reflect reality in some way, various narrow windows of it, maybe it would help to deal with what's happening today to understand and try to judge and rationalize what was done supposedly so many years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's, to me, that notion of mirroring is very rich, because so many of the things that people mentioned as horrifying in the text are very much part of our culture, but in a different form. And does reading the text say that they're okay? Or is the text just helping us to face what it is that we see in our own selves and our own world?
I think there are some questions maybe from the Zoom chat.
So Darren is wondering, I'm curious about how a person with an identity that is being harmed by the text, so for example, identifying as a woman when the text is talking about harm or rape to women, feels like it would be a healing pathway forward when it comes to interacting or lingering with that harmful text. And she clarifies, my curiosity is based on centering the needs of those who are harmed first within community.
So I think that, to me, what Rebecca Alpert's comment was a wonderful way of dealing with that lifting up the destructiveness of that one line, to lie with a man is an abomination, has done such incredible damage, over the course of centuries. To acknowledge that, but then to invite in queer people to the synagogue to talk about their own lives and the path of liberation. And I think we can do things like that with violence against women in the text and ethnocentrism in the text. I mean, the danger is that every week becomes, combat whatever week. But I do think that it's, that it's a possibility, each quarter to take on some difficult thing in the text and turn it into a path of liberation, to turn it into a question. All right, this is appalling. So what do we do? How do we grapple with it? Where do we see the same things in our own society? How do we change it? How do we make the text into a pathway towards transformation?
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to say one thing back in terms of the question you were asking, which in a sense was coming out of a place of taking the Bible, taking these texts as reflecting history, which they may or may not. We don't know that much of this actually took place. To me, I think what a lot of this does is bring up particularly the passages we've been reading the last few weeks in Bereshit. They bring up things that are very real, not necessarily historical, but tension within families, tension within communities, between cousins, who gets the most, who gets the least, who's favored, who's thrown out. All those things give us opportunities to talk about these things, both now and in the future. And I think that's in a sense what we're trying to do. Was there another question from the Zoom? Okay,
There's
and then we're going to move into
a reflection question. I think there's
Okay.
a question. So Sarah says, as someone raised as an atheist Jew, I don't have as much familiarity with scripture, but the idea of ignoring or even excising problematic texts seems like it could lead to a revisionist idea of our own religion or cultural history. And that could feed the idea of religious superiority, which is something I already find problematic in our texts. Look at all the other violent religions.
Now, of course, that's what Reform Judaism is a revision of our tradition in line with the values of the Reformers. So
that's in a sense, that's really ultimately the question that we're dealing with. Like, what do we lose if we throw things out wholesale? What do we gain by keeping this whole picture? And how do we keep the whole picture without making horrific things, without claiming that horrific things are sacred? So that's what we're trying to balance here. And I think basically what we balance anytime we confront these texts, because everybody's been laughing when, we say, well, we could do this every week. Yes, these are difficult. This text, it's not, well, Judith has explained to me, the Quran doesn't have these kinds of things. It has stories about people who are all good. Our tradition has stories about people and God who are not so good from our point of view. We don't want to take these as examples. But then what are they doing here? And how do we relate to them? So that's the context here. So,
So what we like to do is form groups of 4. So 2 Havrutas next to each other form a group of 4.
Or 5
or
if you
five,
were 3,
whatever, if you were 3.
Yeah.
And what we'd like people to think about is, how have you dealt with the text that you mentioned or that came into your mind? And how are you now thinking you might like to deal with it? So how would you deal with the text, and how would you like to see Shir Tikva deal with the text that you had in mind?
Okay, so we'll give a little bit more.
Yeah, we'll give 12 minutes this time. So everybody take around 3 minutes and be aware of.
Yeah, don't the first person talk too long. That's about half our time, so just to give you a time check. Yeah. you can't hear as well. Okay. Thanks for letting us know.
Okay, let's finish your sentence and let's start coming back together. Oh, yeah, it is.
Thank you. Yeah, I know. It's on.
Yeah, I know. I'm just going to. So again, we'd like to hear from a few folks about where your conversation took you in terms of how you might deal with the text that you thought of earlier, or what you'd like to see happen at Shir Tikva. I mean, we just welcomed our friend Rabbi Ariel, so now let's cause some trouble for her, right?
Good trouble, as
Good
John
trouble,
Lewis
yeah,
said.
yeah, right.
Becca.
I sang a tiny song. I made it up on the spot. But the thing that I have been thinking about since you said it, Judith, is the thing in the context of this confronting, which I love, is the thing about kissing the Torah. Mm-hmm. And I'm not suggesting we don't, because I actually really I think it's sweet. And I feel similarly excited to kiss the Torah. But I wish now that we had a different way of holding that kissing with that salt that we take in during Pesach, and a framing of what the heck is this? And then I said, what if we had a different song? And it was how'd it go? It was this is the Torah, we really read it, and some of it we like, and some of it is shit. That was a different version. So, but fundamentally, this is when I say to my kid what it is, it's cautionary tale or reasons, things to not do, things to look at ourselves and learn who we are, who we have been, and what we want to be different. And because I do think that historically it has been a model and a teacher in the most linear and boring way.
I just need to say in response to that we have a good friend who has spent a lot of time in India studying the Jews of Cochin, but she has pointed out that the Torah procession is really like many Indian processions with various deities, and there's almost a disconnect. There is a disconnect between the processional aspect, and there being processions in so many different cultures and are enjoying a procession, and what the actual substance of the text is, and how we deal with that disjunction, is a question. But I find it very helpful because at BJ everybody rushes to kiss the Torah, and I think to myself each week, this is our procession. Really doesn't have anything to do with what we're processing toward, in a sense.
But I love your song.
Yeah, oh, it's great, yeah.
I'm going to try to remember that. I might be in touch. Okay, we haven't heard from you yet. And then
So I want to say probably two things. One is we thought of a fourth way of approaching difficult text, horrible, horrendous text, and one is to ask what text do we want, right? And there are people doing that, and we at Shir Tikva use Aurora Levins Morales a lot to lift up, and she's part of a project on Rimonim, lifting up, particularly from Jews of color. So that's one thing. The other thing I would love Shir Tikva to do is to have little goats on Yom Kippur. Really, they do that in Philly, because it's a tikkun with the animal world. And the goats feel a lot of love when they're petted and honored on Yom Kippur. I guess the third thing that's serious, that was came out of our group was a core text, of course, is Exodus. So maybe Shir Tikva could spend a year looking at, we were slaves. Well, let's also look at how we are Pharaoh.
Okay, over here.
I just wanted to lift up one of the questions that Rabbi Joey posed as a way to examine a text or confront it is, where do I find myself in this? How do I cast myself in this text?
I think often that's very helpful, particularly. I felt a lot of that these last month or two when we've been in the book of Breshit, when we're talking about all these family stories and family dynamics. Most of us have some experience of being in some kind of family and having some kind of feelings that are in one way or another reflected in these texts. So that's a very useful model.
And it's also important that we don't project everything that's negative onto the text, but that we do take in the things that we reproduce in the text.
Okay. Why don't we go back there and then we'll go to Rabbi Ariel, who I think has stuff from the Zoom.
I know I'm being like those who remember Horseshack in Mr. Cotter's class. So when we lift up what you called a mirror, and we bring awareness to problems in our current culture and say that the text is pointing us to what we don't want to do. We've been talking about this kind of sideways or around this, but to me there's a level at which it feels like we're disrespecting our elder, like we're embracing, but we're saying we're publicly shaming our elder, kind of. And I'm not saying I don't do this, because I do, but I would love to hear thoughts on how, once we do lift up the mirror and talk directly about how problematic it is, what are some strategies for returning to the holiness of why we do parade and kiss the text and so on?
Yeah, and I think to me, the fact that I lift up what's problematic in this text, as opposed to so many other texts, that I choose to remain in relationship with and grapple with this text, that's the fundamental sign of, I don't know if respect is the right word, connection. I refuse to disconnect. That's the ultimate respect to me.
Nice. Okay. So 2 comments from Zoom. Darcy says, I think it would be great if we could do a community-made resource list where we could find perspectives as we work through difficult texts. So Google Doc links where we can share resources and distribute the load and let us find additional resources and perspectives. And there was a clarifying of like, is that a Safaria resource? Is that, and it was sheer tikva made. So bring on the challenges, Darcy, thank you. And Emma says, something I've been thinking about in thinking about difficult texts, I draw a distinction between Torah and Tanakh and liturgy. Regarding Tanakh, I feel it's very valuable to continue to read and wrestle with the text in its totality, given that these texts have been handed down for so long. And even if we stopped reading the challenging parts would still be present in the larger tradition. And regarding liturgy, my inclination is to keep expanding our tradition. It's continued to evolve over the millennia, and I see no reason we should stop evolving. Mm-hmm. Let's keep pulling from ancient wisdom and playing with it to speak to our current values and reality.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, although I would also like to come back to the comment in the front that lifting up alternative texts in the context of our sacred space, I think is enormously important. And we were actually hoping to be part of a Haftorah project that looked like it was going to get off the ground and then didn't. But offering an alternative reading for every week that would pick up one of the themes in the Torah portion, but from a completely different perspective and lifting up marginalized voices within the tradition. I think that's a hugely important project.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the same way that this person was making a distinction between liturgy, which is continually evolving, and Tanakh, which the text is there, I mean, our readings of it are continually evolving. We were thinking in the same way about Haftarot in particular, because Haftarot were introduced as additional readings. At least one understanding is because at a time when people Jews were not allowed to read Torah, so they tried to find something from elsewhere in the Tanakh that dealt with those themes. Where they come up with these readings is a whole other thing. We just completed a year of studying of that and didn't feel much clearer at the end of the year than we did at the beginning. But so clearly there's room even within a kind of, I don't know, semi-halachic context to say, okay, the additional reading for this week is going to be this short story or this poem or this whatever, which we want to take as a sacred text. I think the thing about liturgy that's sort of interesting is, yes, on the one hand, for sure, it's continually evolving. It's not, we might not think of it as sacred in the same way that every word, of the Torah, of the Tanakh, is not sacred, but it's old for some reason. And yet, I know Judith was very angry when she discovered that she had missed half of the liturgy at a certain point when she, so, which brings us really to another question we wanted to spend a little bit of time on. We don't have a whole lot more, but, did anybody have any thoughts about how to teach, what would be valuable, or how might we teach these things to the next generation? Do we want to teach them? And if we do, how? How do we teach and at the same time engage the next generation in critique? Yeah.
One of the suggestions that came up in our chavruta that I really enjoyed was having not just teaching, but then having, the pedagogy of active practice through I think what was suggested was a Mishnah style alternative endings exercise, which to me kind of speaks, Deborah, to what you were saying too, of honoring our elders and honoring these stories by also really trying to get inside the circumstances of how did this series of events in this story come to be? What choice points were and weren't available to these people? And where are there choice points where you would make a different choice? And what choice would you make, and how would you steer this story in a different direction? So getting past the point of just being able to say this is problematic, but really being able to say, what happened? How do we understand how we got to this point, and how could we have redirected?
That is lovely.
Yeah,
Thank you. That's terrific. Noam, did you want to?
Yeah, it's a short comment about like the pedagogy of how you do it. Because I feel like if you study the Parsha every week and you focus on these issues, you just like, you spend all of your time studying these things and you miss so much of the rest of Torah, because some Parshas are so packed and you have like, 45 minutes, 1 hour a week in which you study. And Torah is not only these it's like these problematic people that you just spend, they just take all the space and you spend all the time talking about them and you want to talk about other things, but you just have to talk about. So if there's a way not to do it with the Parsha, but just like address those issues outside of like the weekly cycle of reading Torah, because I wouldn't want the experience of learning Torah to be just like a blow after blow after blow. And like I learned Torah as a kid in school because I grew up in Israel, and that's just like part of the core curriculum is Torah. And we were taught we weren't taught the very difficult things, but we grew up like loving Torah because we did like those plays of like stories and and when I grew up I learned some of the things I wasn't like, oh, how didn't you tell me? Like I know you didn't tell me because I was a kid and it was not appropriate to tell me these things, but now I can learn them. And you learn Torah every year. You can 1 year focus on this and the next year focus on that. So my point is, let's not spend all the time just like grappling with the horrible stuff that store has, because there's more.
There's enough horrible stuff in the world already.
I just wanted to share a story, because in this room earlier today was a 13-year-old becoming bar mitzvah. And I've been holding him really close to me through this conversation, because in the moment when his mom handed him the Torah, it was like so disproportionately large compared to this human being. And he held it in the most like broken-hearted, courageous, and awkward way, just because it took up so much of his body, and it was on the wrong shoulder and nothing really, but he was holding it, and it looked like he was clinging to it, and it was clinging, like I didn't know who was going to hit it just really, and it felt like somatically, the room just took this breath of, like he was embodying this thing that we're holding, the challenge and the impossibility of being in relationship with Torah. And it just made me wish, in addition to all of the speeding up and deepening with story, that we could also just spend more time holding, like as a somatic practice of feeling the heaviness of it, because there was actually information that came from just this human being who had spent a year getting ready, awkwardly holding Torah.
Let's take, okay, we've got 3 more. We'll take those 3, and then we need to, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just want to say, I attend a lot of the B'nai Mitzvot here at Shir Tikva, and our young people are confronting these questions. I mean, they are bringing up things that they find problematic and asking questions about them. So, they're already doing it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the best things, one of the most exciting things about being at B'nai Mitzvah for me also, is realizing that's what's going to keep the next generation with us, if they know they can continue to engage with these texts even when they're problematic. So that's a very beautiful image. Okay, MJ in the back.
I think that for me, this is part of how I specifically asked the question about what I want to pass on to my youth, and just a thing that has been like bubbling through me through this conversation and in conversation with my chavruta. And I think it has to do with like what our relationship with that thing is, both the literal thing and the figurative thing of Torah. And I think that what I want for myself and what I hope I get to pass on to my kid is that like everything that I am is in there, and everything that is in there is in me. including and sometimes especially the ugly stuff. And that my job, and that the thing I think I want to teach about it, is that our job is to not deny the ugly stuff, to recognize it and to recognize it in ourselves so that we can then make some choices about what we want to do with that ugliness. And then at the end of that, like to see it whole, to see one another whole, to see ourselves as whole, as dark and light and all the shades of darkness and light in between, to then be able to kiss that thing, to see it whole and still be able to find a place to love it, that feels like the work to me. Mm-hmm. And it feels like the work that I want to pass on to my kid and kids and their kids.
Thank you. I think there was one, no, okay. All right, so we're just about out of time. That's a beautiful way to end. Should I do this or? I don't know. All right, so the possible third part, which obviously we don't have time for, but I will just throw out a bunch of things to think about because in this particular moment, so many of the last few weeks, as I mentioned before, so many of the last few weeks' Torah readings seem to have uncanny resonances with what's happening in the Middle East. How might we respond to the powerful and problematic contemporary echoes of what we're reading? We've been reading about familial conflict, hatred between brothers, fear, anger, possible reconciliations. All this while, in the Middle East, Israel and Hamas are engaged in a brutal conflict over inheritance, power, land, and recognition. So, some questions to think about. How have you, or might you, and this is sort of what we were talking about a couple minutes ago, think about the text of Breshit as we read and watch the news coming from the Middle East? Do they allow us to reflect in some ways on what's inside of us as well as what we're sort of projecting onto others? Think back to the strategies Judith was talking about before: ignore, redeem, and confront. Can our sacred texts provide any insights into what we're living now? Have they provided any resources for you in recent months? And I've just been, this was again related to something somebody said recently, both in the US and in Israel in recent months, politicians and activists have been citing the Bible as justification for all kinds of policies and practices. In Israel, we hear we were promised this land by God, told to eliminate the existing residents and make it our dwelling place, and therefore we can do basically whatever we please. In the United States, evangelicals are increasingly citing the Bible as sacred text and essentially as an additional founding document of the United States. I was horrified, I have to say, most recently when Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, said in response to a question from reporters, "What does Mike Johnson think about any issue under the sun?" Well, go pick up a Bible off your shelf and read it. That's my worldview. The claim somehow that what's written in the Bible is sacrosanct and must be given precedence even over existing US laws. So we've just been looking at how there are many passages in the Torah and in the Bible that we don't necessarily take as models for action. So how do we think about engaging with people in the public square around biblical texts? An important reminder, virtually no one, including Mike Johnson, I would be sure, takes all of the Bible literally. Every engagement is necessarily partial. All our readings, including those coming out of the Haredi and government faction in Israel, involve picking and choosing what we highlight and what we ignore or downplay. That's related to the strategies Judith was talking about before. So, and at the same time, I'm not providing answers here, just more questions. At the same time as we do sometimes want to look to the Torah for guidance, we're not wanting to throw this whole thing out with the bathwater. Remember the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Do not oppress the poor. Treat everyone equally. Don't put a stumbling block before the blind, and any number of other wonderful passages. So what are we doing when we look to the Torah or the Bible for our values, given that a good deal of what is central to it we find abhorrent? So how is it? How are we thinking about that kind of dance that we've been doing here today? And I think many of us do a lot of the time when we're confronting these texts, that we still want to continue to engage with them, as MJ and many others have said, and at the same time be able to hold that not everything written on that parchment is holy, holy in the sense of a model for us to act. Maybe what it is are kind of way stations for us to look in to ourselves, because these are the things that are perhaps most problematic. Anyway, I guess, so that's more or less our time. Should we? And thank you. We thought we might end also with a song. Kol haolam kulo gesher tsar meod, gesher tsar meod, gesher tsar meod. Kol haolam kulo gesher tsar meod, gesher tsar meod. V'haikar, lo lefaked klal. V'haikar, lo lefaked klal. Thank you all very much. This was a great city.
Could we get just like one more round of Shir Tikva? We'll be moving towards snack time in a moment. Just to say, Rabbi Rappaport and myself have given ourselves the somewhat challenging assignment of following these folks with a series of workshop on challenging texts on 2 Wednesdays evenings during the month of January. If you might be interested in applying some of what we've learned today to some specific texts, there are sign-up sheets over there, or you can find the registration for the class on Hineni's website.
Oh, great.
Well,
Yes, snack time for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll be gathering for singing and Havdalah in here, followed by intergenerational dance party. Am I missing anything? Awesome.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.
The view.
I mean, these are great.
Thank you. I can't wait to see what goes through this.
It's so exciting. I'm gonna put that up.
And how you spoke at the end about way stations and just looking into it. That was such a beautiful, wow, really. I found myself in the back being like, I wish I could speak, like, that feeling in the lecture where you're like, I just want to keep talking, and then I was like, oh, thank God. Thank you so much.
It's a joy to be preaching here. Great. That's really a great picture.
You play beautifully off of each other, and I feel like you both offered. I felt like you were both bringing your Torah and also honoring each other's Torah in such powerful ways. So thank you for modeling that.
Also, like, hearing you teach so much of what we've been doing for like years now. Forever. Our text and Torah. So it's like, I know some of how you think about it because like we've been grappling, but we'll let some other people come.
Hi.